Hello folks, I'm Cooper, and today on Cooking with Cleavers we're talking about traits or qualities to look for in a Chinese slicing cleaver. So if you're going out to like a Chinese market or an Asian market or whatever and you see a slicing cleaver or cleavers there, what you can use to determine if it's a good buy, something that might be enjoyable to use, and some traits that might be less so enjoyable or whatever. A few things we'll talk about are general lengths of cleavers that I like, weights, so how much total they weigh, handle construction, steel, as well as other dimensions of the blades that are nice to use. So this is a knife that is something indicative of what you might find at a Chinese market. It's made by Qianlong Biezuo, which is just some random manufacturer here in Taiwan. So this knife is not going to be any particularly famous knife, and probably the manufacturer stamps a different stamp on the blade for various contracts and the like. So something like this is very common to find in a Chinese market where you don't really know what the company is, but they make knives. So how do you know if it's any good? Well, first, a couple of things to note about enjoyable slicing cleavers. Generally, I prefer a slicing cleaver that is longer, like this CCK 1301. It has a 240 millimeter or like 9.5 inch, somewhere around there, long blade. Somewhere between 205 and 240 millimeters is generally what I like. So somewhere between like 8 and 9.5 inches is generally what I prefer in a slicing cleaver. You can get smaller slicing cleavers like this one. I think the blade on this one is 150 or something millimeters, or 160, 170 millimeters, so like 6.5 inches. That's a little bit short for my taste. It also is a little bit light. I think this cleaver weighs like 250 grams, which is fairly light for a cleaver, but it's just a little bit small for general purpose, multi-purpose knife. So I generally prefer a longer blade. Next is another dimension that's important is spine width. So the blade of the width of a spine is important to manage weight as well as strength of said blade. Many cleavers you will see are not slicing cleavers. They'll be like heavy cleavers for breaking bones and the like, cutting through boned meats and whatever. These cleavers have very thick spines and then maintain that thickness throughout the blade. You can see here from the choil that it's a fairly thick blade all the way up through to the edge. On slicing cleavers, you'll generally want to have a spine width of less than 2 millimeters. The nicer slicing cleavers I have generally have less than 1.8 millimeters of spine width. Right at the handle it might be a little bit thicker because they, the way they forge these knives, there's a steel tang that runs through the wood blades, or the wood handles. So right at the where the blade joins into the handle will be a little thicker to reinforce that tang. But outside of that, up along the spine from at least the middle up through the tip, I generally prefer a spine width of 1.8 millimeters or less. The thinner it is, the lighter it will be, which will reduce fatigue, generally speaking. Then you can look at the choil and see how it tapers out. I generally prefer as thin as possible up towards the blade. So the way that thins out will help the blade glide through foods when you're using a push cut or a chop cut. The thinner it is, the less it'll hang up on any particular food item. So we've talked about length as well as width of the spine of the blade. Next is height. Blade height is a very important aspect of Chinese slicing cleavers. There's a large variation in heights. For example, this is a very small Chinese slicing cleaver. It only has like 55 millimeters of height. I generally, this is not what I use for like a multi-purpose Chinese slicing cleaver. This is what I might use for like some small fruit or something. So a shorter knife has less utility. However, a taller knife is also somewhat unwieldy. So this particular knife is like 11 millimeters or 12 millimeters tall. So around 11 millimeters tall, which is a little bit tall for my liking. I generally prefer a blade height between like 9 millimeters on this like CCK 1902 to 10 millimeters or so on this CCK 1903. Honestly, the blade height is only slightly different, but just that little height makes it a little bit less controllable. There are certain Chinese slicing cleavers that are marketed as kitchen slicing cleavers, or as like chef's Chinese slicing cleavers, or professional versions, and they'll be 12, can be up to like 12 or 13 millimeters tall, which gives you a lot of surface area on your blade to use it to scoop stuff up. But if you're a general if you're just an in-home cook cooking for a few people, I think it's more controllable and easier to use, and still has the utility of scooping effect with about a 9 to 10 millimeter high blade. Handle construction. Handles come in a few different varieties for Chinese slicing cleavers. The traditional varieties are wood handles. They can be stained, they can be finished, they can be very rough, sometimes not well sanded. There's a whole variety of different things in those wood handles. Generally, what you want to look for is that there are no like splintering or cracks in the wood handles. Outside of that, you can sand things down, you can finish things yourself, and you can oil handles yourself. Just make sure that the wood handles, one, you grab it and it's comfortable to grab, and that there are not any cracks or anything, because if it's cracked, there's nothing you can do about it. If it's a little bit rough, you can sand it down yourself. Or if you don't want to put any work into it, get a slightly, look for something slightly nicer, like maybe a CCK 1912, where it comes fairly well finished off and nice and smooth. Other handle types. There are commonly all steel construction knives like this Shibazu Zuo. This one has one of the best steel handles I've found in a Chinese slicing cleaver. Many of the metal handles I find are not particularly comfortable, so before you buy the knife, try to pull it out of whatever container it is and put it in your hand and see if it feels comfortable. Some of the metal knives just feel metal handles feel very hollow and or slick. So try to feel it out and see if it feels good. Generally speaking, a wood handle will generally be reasonable to use. I haven't found a wood handle that I don't like. Okay, I have found a couple of wood-handled Chinese slicing cleavers that I don't like, but they're very, very cheap slicing cleavers, like this one that I bought, which was less than $3 at a market here in Taiwan. And it's overall just a garbage knife, but the wood handle is it's very strangely slick and weirdly shaped and not comfortable. So try to pick up the handle or pick up the knife, hold it in your hand before you buy it, if you can. Generally you can. A lot of cleavers will come packaged with just something over the blade, and the handle will often be exposed. You can also always ask if you can take the covering off the blade to see and just feel it out and see if you like it. So we've talked about wood handles, metal handles. There's also some other variations in handles, like this Jun knife has a rubberized handle. Generally, I don't recommend this particular knife, but the handle's comfortable-ish, can be fine. Try it out. Another option is a slightly more westernized type handle, like on this Maestro. This works just fine as well. Generally, these will be a little bit more expensive than your wood-handled varieties. Generally speaking, on a Chinese slicing cleaver, they will be heavier than your other kitchen knives. For weight, I generally like a Chinese slicing cleaver to be somewhere between 300 and 400 grams, or like 10.5 to 13.8 ounces, or something like that. But generally they'll be listed in grams for their weights. If you get much past a 400 gram weight limit, you're getting into things like heavier cleavers or mid-weight cleavers that'll be really tiring to use if you're trying to use it as a slicing cleaver. This particular example is a medium weight bone cleaver, and it weighs like 500 grams or thereabouts. So be careful not to get something that's overly heavy. Some people say that, oh, it's the weight that makes it easier to cut, and to a certain degree, having a little more weight, the right type of weight in a Chinese slicing cleaver, helps you to slice through effectively. If you have too much weight, it'll fatigue you and make you tired as you're cooking. So 300 to 400 gram weight range is ideal. Outside of that, there is belly profiles. So on slicing cleavers, the benefit of having a slicing cleaver is that it's a very long, fairly flat blade at the belly. That means it's very good for a push cut or a chop cut through any food. The benefit of having a flatter blade is you don't have to rock it back and forth to make sure you cut everything. You just push down and forward or down, and it'll cut through the entire item because the blade is flat enough and long enough that it'll get through anything you're chopping through. Some Chinese slicing cleavers are not particularly ideal in that they have a belly that is relatively rounded, so you can rock it back and forth and there's not really any flat area. If you're cutting through something that's thicker on your cutting board and it has that sort of belly, if you're just using a chop cut or something like that, having more belly means that parts of the outside edges of whatever you're chopping may not be cut through. So if you have the opportunity when you're buying a Chinese cleaver at a market or whatever, or I guess if you're designing your own, try to look for something or build something yourself that has got a nice flat area on it so that you can cut through the maximum amount of stuff with your push cut or chop cut. And the last thing pretty much is steel types. So there are two general categories of steels that you will find in slicing cleavers. You have your carbon steels, which can come looking in a vast variety of ways. No particular visual clue will tell you that it's a carbon steel. These are all carbon steel knives, for example, which means that they will corrode and rust if not taken care of properly. I personally prefer carbon steels because, generally speaking, especially in cheaper knives, a carbon steel will be easier to sharpen and maintain its sharpness longer, depending, than a cheap stainless steel option. Stainless steel knives are probably best for most people because you can forget them to wash them, leave them sitting in some onions or juices of some acidic fruits or whatever while you eat them, and nothing generally will happen to a stainless steel cleaver if you leave it dirty for a while. These carbon steel knives, Again, these will discolor and start to rust or corrode if you leave them in anything acidic, or really if you don't wash them and dry them quickly, they will start to discolor and corrode. Wash things off quickly and dry them if you're using carbon steel. So maybe a little bit more advanced in the care range if you get a carbon steel knife. Stainless steels are a little bit less intensive essentially than carbon steel. So for most people, I'd say you probably want to start out with a stainless steel knife. I personally use carbon steel knives for most of what I cook. I find it more enjoyable, but I do have several stainless steel knives also, and more than just these ones that I grabbed. But there you go. There's a general discussion on what you want in a Chinese slicing cleaver. Another part of steels is sometimes blades will come advertised with various steel types. If they do, it'll generally be like a CR13 of some sort. So you can have like 3 CR or 5 CR13s. Those are generally more cheaper steels. The higher the number before the CR is generally better. So 8 CR13 is a better quality than a 1 CR or 3 CR or 5 CR13 in terms of edge retention, generally speaking. Do note that sometimes Chinese manufacturers will do this gimmicky thing where they label something that is a 3 CR13 as a 30 CR13. So if there is a 0 after the first number, disregard the 0. So if it's a 30 CR13 or a 50 CR13, it just means it's a 3 CR13 or a 5 CR13. And an 80 CR13 is just an 8 CR13. So those are just some various types of steels that are commonly found in Chinese slicing cleavers. Generally speaking, if it's from some random manufacturer, they won't tell you what type of steel it is, except for maybe carbon steel or stainless steel. They won't tell you necessarily the specific type of carbon or stainless steel. If it's from somebody like Shibazu, they will generally advertise the type of steel in their stainless steel lines. Their carbon steel lines, they just say it's a carbon steel knife. Sometimes they'll say that they have layered steels, like on their, I think it's S215 or maybe it's the S210. I think it's the S215 is the slicing cleaver lineup. On that one, they say it's a layered carbon steel blade. I'd be willing to bet it's really just a monolithic carbon steel, but that's just me. Certainly the BW304, I think that's the number on this one. Whatever, it's the Chinese market of the carbon steel lineup for Shibazu. They don't bother telling you anything about the steel except for that it's carbon steel. So those are a few things to look at when you're going out to purchase a Chinese slicing cleaver. If you're not getting something that's well known or whatever, just general attributes that you should look for. Again, just make sure that it has a nice flat profile along the belly, and it'll probably be fine. And thin along the spine is also important. So keep those things in mind. Make sure you're not picking up something that looks like a slicing cleaver from one side, but then you look at the spine and the choil and see, oh, that's very heavy and thick. This is like a multi-purpose knife, but really a light bone cleaver. Also, generally speaking, I don't generally like things that are marketed as a multi-purpose or dual-purpose cleaver. So anything that they say you can cut vegetables at the tip and bones, thin bones at the heel of the blade. I generally don't like those types of knives. They generally don't perform as well. I just purchased another one of those types, the Shibazu P01, that I'll be doing more testing on. But generally speaking, avoid things that are dual purpose or multi-purpose and get something that's just labeled as a good slicing cleaver or a Chinese chef's knife and is thin and fairly lightweight. So anyway, thank you for watching this episode of Cooking with Cleavers. I'll be putting out more reviews of various things like this Shibazu F2, or this is the P03, but basically F208. I've also got this Shibazu carbon steel line and some Maestro knives and some other knives that I've used rather extensively over the last couple of months. So I have more experience now to share with you in reviews of those likes. So please stay tuned to the channel, and if you are interested in learning more about Chinese slicing cleavers or more about particular models that I recommend and or where to get said models, please subscribe to the channel so you can stay tuned. Hit the notifications bell so you know when I make something. And if you like this, please hit the like button and feel free to share with friends, family, anyone you think would benefit from learning about some great cooking knives, these wonderful Chinese slicing cleavers or Chinese chef's knives. Thank you very much.